Jonathan Panikoff is the director of the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council. Jonathan, I want to start with the man at the center of it all, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He seems absolutely determined to push ahead with his Gaza plan, despite growing backlash at home and abroad. Why do you think he's so set on this path? Is it a risk that he can afford to take politically and domestically?
Good morning. Thanks for having me. I think there's two parts to this. The policy part is that I think Netanyahu and certainly his coalition do fundamentally believe that all of Hamas has to be eliminated, despite the fact that you have almost every senior Israeli military official saying that's just not possible. That's not how this works. Most of Hamas's leadership has already been decimated. It's time to bring the hostages home and move on. Netanyahu seems very committed to doing the opposite. On the political side, which is driving part of the policy, you have in his cabinet a number of, frankly, ultra-nationalists, folks like the finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who actually want Gaza to, frankly, be under Israeli control for good because they want to resettle it with Israelis. And so it's created a political dynamic because Netanyahu needs those right-wing members in order to stay alive politically. He hasn't shown any willingness to change his coalition and maybe do what's in the best interest of a country, the majority of which don't want the war to continue. And so we're stuck right now until somebody, frankly, gives way.
Jonathan, Australia is the latest to say that they will soon recognize a Palestinian state. New Zealand mulling a similar move. I mean, realistically, how much pressure will this put on Israel to rescind its plan to take over Gaza and end the war? And also, how are you viewing this latest declaration by Australia, given that it is also being accused of supplying component parts for military jets to Israel, I mean, that are used to strike Gaza?
Well, I think the Australian decision obviously comes on the heels that we saw from the UK, the Canadians, the Portuguese, obviously the French who started the kind of drive here. I think it's going to have, frankly, unfortunately, very little impact on the decision making. I think the reality is there's already 147 states that have recognized the state of Palestine. It's symbolically meaningful, but its impact is quite limited. I think what you're seeing is the desperation of states who feel like they don't have any other choice because there's no other thing that they can do to really pressure Israel diplomatically. I think there's an awareness that it's really the U.S. who can provide the most pressure. I think their hope is that by doing this, it would help convince maybe President Trump to provide additional pressure. That doesn't seem to have been working quite yet. But look, before the Gaza City operation actually begins in mid-October or early October, there may be a window here. And you're already seeing some discussions that Turkey, Qatar, Egypt are working with Hamas and going back to them with a new proposal for a final ceasefire that would release all hostages. I think there's not a great chance that the gaps can be bridged, but that's the hope. And I think for the Australians and the Germans, for instance, who have just restricted military supplies, you're talking about things that have happened. Those supplies are in Israeli jets. It's a question of, does this change in the future how countries think of Israel and how they're willing to trade with them and engage with them on a security basis as well? And I think it's too early to tell that.
I do want to follow up in that. I mean, just based on that strong condemnation from the UN Security Council, mass protests happening worldwide, has Israel become, or is it becoming, a global pariah? And if so, could this actually play into Hamas' advantage?
It's an incredibly reasonable question because you have the former Israeli Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, who literally said that Israel is becoming a pariah state in a tweet last week. I think there's a lot of Israelis who feel they are. I think it's important to separate the Netanyahu government versus the Israeli public. I think most of the world obviously is not making that separation, understandably. The government was elected. They're the ones representing the Israeli people. But the vast majority of Israelis, the polls are showing 70 to 80%, want the war to be over. They don't want this to continue either. The challenge is right now the government is not willing to budge so far, and that means Prime Minister Netanyahu is not willing to budge. And the international condemnation at the United Nations and by all of the states who have now recognized the state of Palestine or will do so in September, doesn't seem to be moving the diplomatic needle quite yet, as much as I think a lot of people are hoping that it will. And after 21 months, this war can finally come to an end.
And Jonathan, many are arguing that recent developments have effectively put the two-state solution on life support, if not outright dead. What's your take on this? How realistic is the prospect of a two-state solution at this point?
I think it's very far away. The problem is, and this connects with the issue of recognition, is that yes, this actually, the Israelis are not wrong in that there's a shock in the Israeli public, even those who want the war to end, that the Palestinian state is being recognized as they still have 1,200 who were killed because of Hamas on October 7th, 251 taken hostage, 50 still in captivity, 20 still alive. And so they're looking around the world and saying, how in the world are we going to have a Palestinian state right next door? Which, by the way, is, of course, what Hamas doesn't want. They don't want a two-state solution. They just want a Palestinian state without Israel. That's created a real tension here because the only people that seem to be winning are the extremists in Gaza, in the West Bank, as well as in Israel as well. And so I think we're at this point where, look, we're talking about a two-state solution, but it's worth remembering we're not even close to final status issues of how you would do borders and refugees and Jerusalem, the issues that have long been the actual crux of a two-state. And now you're adding all of the significant challenges that come related to Gaza. I think we're farther away from a two-state solution, unfortunately, at any time since the Oslo Accords were signed in 1993.
Yeah, Jonathan, just a quick one. Tendentially, polls have indicated that a majority of Jewish Israelis and Palestinians no longer actually support the idea of a two-state solution. Why has the solution become so unappealing?
I think on both sides, what they're reflecting is frankly violent. The Palestinians, the number of wars that we've seen in Gaza and the number of incursions into the West Bank by the IDF over the years, what was supposed to be sovereignty from the original Palestinian Authority has really succumbed to, frankly, nothing more than a chopped up state in the West Bank that's not going to be able to fulfill the requirements of what you would need to have a country. The borders, the separations, you have settlers that are dividing it. And of course, in Israel, there were years of terrorist attacks. And their view is, look, we've come close. We've offered and offered and offered. From Oslo on, there was multiple situations. 1998 at Y, 2000 Camp David, 2008. And the Israeli public has gone further and further right. And so the reality is both sides are moving further apart on the ground among their populations.
All right, Jonathan, appreciate your time. Jonathan Panikoff, the Director, Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council.